Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Coda, hope you're doing well, and winter is here. Norsca has finally broken past the Night's Watch and straight into Total War Warhammer, intent on bringing ruin and carnage to every race in the old world, and soon enough, to the new world as well. Norsca is living proof of just how far the corrupted tendrils of chaos have spread in the Warhammer universe. And after playing with them for about a week or two now, I can easily say that playing with the Norsca Faction has proven to be one of the most fun times I've ever had in this game, hands down. So in this guide, I'll be going through the current Norsca Faction roster, and that means reviewing each unit's battlefield purpose, their general strengths and weaknesses, and just kind of the overall general strategies for using them. This information can be applied to campaign, single player, multiplayer, or, however you like to enjoy the game, because that's what's important. The only real requirement is an uncontrollable desire to crush everything in your path. For the dark gods, not because it's fun. As a faction, Norsca is a rush army, heavily reliant on momentum. Specifically, the momentum created from their colossal monsters, who also act as living battering rams and basically blow holes straight through the enemy battle line, which are then in turn flooded by your hordes of bloodthirsty infantry. More than any race prior, Norsca depends on powerful monsters, which they have an ample supply and variety of. They're sort of like an anchor to most of their builds, but need to be supported by the various other melee and missile units in the Norsca Army. Norscan monsters are designed to crush enemy battle lines, plain and simple. A Norscan general wants nothing more than head-on engagements, where they can go toe-to-toe with their opponents front and center. This is where Norsca is the most powerful, where their twisted monsters rack up kills and their insane infantry buff the shit out of themselves in a fit of rage. All in all, the point being, Norsca are designed to win the frontline engagement. They have a wide variety of melee infantry choices, which allows the versatility to tailor your build however needed. They have unarmored, armored, armor-piercing, non-armor piercing, anti-large, high damage dealers, shielded, non-shielded, pretty much everything actually, now that I look at it. This makes them pretty flexible in bringing the right tools against the various different factions. They also have very powerful lords and heroes, which are also quite versatile. Some are able to be taken on foot, chaos steed, chariot, or even a colossal war mammoth. Others are such powerful monsters themselves that they don't need a mount. As far as lores go, they have access to, as far as magic goes, they have access to the lores of death, metal, fire, and shadows. 4 lores built around causing pure carnage and destruction. They also have some unique faction-wide abilities to emphasize these strengths. Rage and Berserk are 2 mechanics given to most of the human marauder units in the Norscan roster, chiefly your infantry, chariots, and missiles. This is a timed mechanic that makes these units stronger the longer they stay in combat. First is a leadership buff, then a physical resistance, and finally a buff to melee attack. So this is a clear sign that Norsca wants their enemies to stay put and grind it out. And in order to stay put, many of the Norscan monsters in turn have the frostbite mechanic, which basically cuts their enemies' speed in half, making it much more difficult for them to escape. So these things are meant to be used together, right? These 2 unique mechanics kind of foreshadow the overall Norscan synergy and game plan. Where they're lacking, however, are in some of the more auxiliary departments. Most notably, cav. They have no shock, melee, or armored cav on the entire roster. They have units that are kinda sorta like it, or that have the ability to mitigate it, or are kinda meant to counter it. But overall, they're slower on the flanks, susceptible to rear charges, and just overall more vulnerable to cav tactics. And while they do have some good missile units of their own, they're also generally vulnerable to enemy missiles and artillery themselves, especially their large monsters. This is in large part due to their general lack of armor. Most of their units aren't well armored at all, and the few that are generally very expensive. Which leads me then to cost. Some of the most brutal Norscan monsters have very high gold costs, and a Norsca army can be vulnerable to being outnumbered if they invest too heavily in them. So you gotta strike a balance between numbers and monsters with the Norsca faction. And kind of the last thing to keep in mind is leadership. They don't have great leadership. A throng of barbarians and monsters are difficult enough to control when things are going well. But if things start to go south, then they can get out of control pretty quickly. In this case, that means running off the field. But yeah, that's the general kind of makeup, the pros and cons of Norsca as a whole. You know, nothing super detailed, but pretty decent summary overview. But let's jump right into it, starting with the lords. The first legendary lord for Norsca is Wulfric the Wanderer, the Hunter of Champions, Eternal Challenger, and basically the Norscan poster boy. He's one of the more versatile legendary lords that we've seen, basically because of his mount options. He can be taken on foot or on horseback, where he's a lethal duelist with a high melee attack stat of 70, a pretty huge weapon strength of 490, and solid armor of 100, I think also with a silver shield. However, you need to be careful as he doesn't do armor-piercing damage, which can frankly put him at a disadvantage in duels with heavily armored lords who do. However, if you want armor-piercing damage on Wulfric, all you have to do is bring him on his pet Fluffy. He'll gain about 400 points of it and 7,000 points of HP. He obviously loses the duelist trait as well as some melee stats because he's really just kind of sitting on a chair. Wulfric has two unique abilities. The first is the Hunter of Champions, a 24-second hex that severely debuffs an enemy lord or hero, lowering their armor, speed, and melee defense. The other is Seafang, his infamous longship, which he pretty much summons through like a portal in the warp, and it manifests in the form of a damage-dealing wind not really a spell, is it? It's like a wind damage-dealing non-spell. It doesn't do magic damage, but it's very potent against lines of enemy infantry. Sort of like Winds of Death, but not quite that powerful, luckily for everybody. Next up is Throg. Throg the Troll King is the second legendary lord for Norsca. He's a brutal heavy hitter, and he's my alcoholic uncle. He's specifically from the Wintertooth faction. Throg is classified as hammer infantry, but he's a monster. He's not the size of Kolic or Durthu monster. He's about the size of Orion or, something like that, troll size. The point is he hits extremely hard with a weapon strength of 495 that's also armor piercing and anti-large. He also has a pretty devastating kick that gets about, 2, maybe 3 feet off the ground. Whether he decides to use his 8-foot-long Warhammer or his dad's softball beer league kick is totally luck of the draw, so just watch out for that. But anyway, Throg has a couple of other great perks. He does frostbite damage, which, like we said before, cuts his enemy speed in half. He regenerates lost health automatically, because he's a troll. And he can projectile vomit on someone 100 meters away, which causes magic and fire damage, so excuse me. However, like most large lords, he's vulnerable to missile fire, especially fire arrows. Even more so because he has lighter armor than most other lords in the game. Personally, I really like Throg, other than the drinking, but you should make sure that you're being careful with him when you're facing off against a lot of missiles. And if you're facing off against Throg, focus fire him. The last and current lone generic lord is the Marauder Chieftain, basically a diet version of Wulfric. He costs quite a bit less but has worse stats. No Hunter of Champions, no Seafang, nothing like that. He does, however, have the same versatility in terms of mount options, including the War Mammoth, but also the Chariot and the Steed. He's obviously a good choice if you're looking to save money on a lord, or get a War Mammoth as a lord for cheaper. His stats are closer to those of like a generic General of the Empire or Lord of Bretonnia, and considerably lower than like the generic Orc Lord, Beastmen or Chaos Lords, but that makes sense because even though he's a crazy-ass barbarian, he's still a human. And as far as heroes go, Norsca have some pretty damn good ones as well. The Skinwolf Werekin is the lone melee hero option, but when they're this good, you don't need more than one. The Werekin might be my personal favorite unit in the entire faction, if not definitely top 5. And in my opinion, he's one of the most powerful melee units in the game, especially in terms of cost to power ratio. Because of that, it wouldn't surprise me if his cost eventually went up or his stats went down at some point, but even if that does happen, he'll still probably be worth taking. He has a whopping weapon strength of 420 that's both armor piercing and anti-large, so he hits like a Gorbel, but he also has Frenzy, so he's hitting even harder than a Gorbel most of the time. And he can Vanguard deploy, which is completely terrifying. But what makes him so good, in my opinion, is his durability. He has armor, a physical resistance, and regeneration. Regen is always very good on any unit, but on a unit like this especially because it makes him more of a factor in the endgame of a battle. Oftentimes the most important, and when it can really help to have another hero around, or especially if you lost your lord. On top of that, he has access to an additional piece of war gear, which is called the Ruinous Flesh. This adds plus 18 armor to him and to units around him, so he's kind of a force multiplier as well. I mean, all in all, the Skinwolf Werekin is useful in pretty much any matchup, but especially against large units with armor. As far as magic goes, magic comes in two forms for the Norsca faction, or two species. The Shaman Sorcerers are humans corrupted by chaos who can harness the winds of magic. They have access to the lores of death, metal, and fire. If you want to take the lore of death or metal, you must take a Shaman Sorcerer, as the next class of caster does not have access to those lores. And the lore of metal has become a lot more viable in the most recent patch, so definitely a reason to take these guys. In addition, the Shaman Sorcerers also have the versatility to be mounted on a steed or a chariot, so they can get added mobility or durability. The other species that lends magical support to the hordes of Norsca are the Famir Balefiends. The Famir are a bizarre race of hulking, cycloptic, reptilian humanoids that dwell in the swamps and bogs of the Chaos Wasteland. They have access to the lore of fire and the lore of shadows. Much like the lores of metal and death are exclusively for the Shaman Sorcerers, the lore of shadows may only be taken by a Famir Balefiend. The lore of fire is the only one where you have a choice. I guess it's like easier to learn? I don't really know. Famir Balefiends are true melee caster hybrids, as they can do pretty significant damage in combat as well as magic. They have 400 weapon strength that's armor piercing, armor sundering, and does magic damage, so yikes. The kind of caster that you take really is mostly dependent on the lore that you want, which is actually kind of a cool little mechanic for Norsca. So moving right along to melee infantry. The core of the Norsca faction is made up of throngs of marauders who have pledged themselves to the Dark Gods. The lowest tier of these are the Marauders with Shields, which are pretty much carbon copies of the Marauders and the Warriors of Chaos faction. The only difference is the Norscan Marauders have the Rage mechanic, which means the longer they stay in combat, the more powerful they become, and the more value they produce for you. Rage was already covered a little bit earlier in this video. If I can, I'll like put a time link or something in here. But all in all, Marauders, they aren't huge damage dealers, but they do have pretty decent melee stats, especially for low tier infantry. The Icehorn Marauders are the first Norscan regiment of a renown unit, and these guys are a band of literal Vikings that come from the coldest and most brutal part of Norsca, which I'd have to imagine is pretty cold and brutal. Not only do they have much better combat stats, but they are immune to vigor and immune to psychology as well. Two stats that are pretty much invaluable in total war. It basically means that they never tire, and they aren't affected by things like fear or terror. To give you kind of an idea, the few other units in the entire game that are also immune to vigor are the most expensive and elite cav options in the Bretonnia faction, but they have horses to do the running for them. Vigor is very valuable in this game. I mean, exhausted infantry perform much worse than fresh infantry, and it's much harder to go from exhausted to fresh sometime during the battle. This, in my opinion, makes the Icehorn Marauders particularly valuable again in the endgame. Marauders aren't elite infantry, they don't have good armor or do armor piercing damage, but they can excel in certain matchups because they have relatively good melee attack and defense stats. They should be able to stand and bang with most low-tier spear or sword units of other factions. Just try not to get them stuck on anything with heavy armor or anything large, because they have other variations for those jobs. Much like the Warriors of Chaos, Marauders can come equipped in more ways than one. Only unlike Chaos, they have 3 options instead of 2. Marauders with spears sacrifice the shield and some melee attack to gain melee defense, a bonus versus large, and charge defense against large foes. A pretty decent choice for intercepting your opponent's cav, and that can become pretty valuable for Norsca because remember, you don't have any cav. Just make sure that you keep them braced if possible. I see a lot of people kind of charge their spear units into cav, which is, kind of the natural first thing to do, but try to keep them braced. Marauders with great weapons are basically carbon copies of the Chaos version, only again they have the Rage mechanic. Their main strength is dealing pretty decent amounts of armor piercing damage. So they can stand and bang pretty efficiently with a lot of pretty much any unit with decent armor. Although these 3 variations of Marauders, or 4 if you include the Ice Horns, are, they're the quote lowest tier of Norscan infantry, but they're still quite a bit more dangerous than things like Bretonnian men-at-arms, goblins, and even Empire state troops. But if that's not enough and low tier infantry aren't your thing, then you don't need to worry about it, because Marauder Berserkers are the real deal. These psychotic Vikings are the real damage dealers for the Norsca infantry corps. They do very, very high amounts of damage at a very high weapon strength, although they aren't armor piercing, though, that usually doesn't stop them from laying the hurt on pretty much anything. They're not unlike the Forsaken, the Forsaken unit in the Warriors of Chaos faction, although they don't have the speed or armor value to match them. They do still trade efficiently with them, however, thanks to one thing in particular: the Berserk mechanic. Berserk is like an Uber version of the Rage mechanic. Every buff that Rage gives, Berserk basically doubles, and happens a little bit faster. So after 22 seconds, they gain plus 16 leadership. After 44 seconds, plus 22% physical resistance, and after 66 seconds, if anything can last that long, they gain plus 16 melee attack. Plus 16, not 16%. And although obviously all of those are super good, in my opinion, the leadership buff is probably the most valuable because it means that they aren't the ones breaking if it's a close combat. But yeah, obviously all of those are extremely good. So again, the most value that you'll get in terms of actual trade efficiency will be in sustained combat. The only problem is there aren't a ton of units that can survive in combat with Berserkers for over a minute. And if the regular Berserkers seem like a good option to you, just wait until you see the Brutes of the Hound. These guys are the Regiment of Renowned Berserker unit who have dedicated themselves to the Hound God. You might know the Hound God by a different name: Blood for the Hound God, Bones for the Treepin. They are unbreakable, which means they never out, so they can achieve their Berserk melee attack buff of plus 16 all the quicker. The Brutes absolutely tear through anything without armor, and honestly, most things with armor as well. But the most elite melee infantry in the Norsca faction are the Marauder Champions, those Marauders closest to receiving the gifts of the Dark Gods that they want so badly. Although it's a little bit debatable exactly where they stack up with the units they supposedly aspire to be, that's a topic for another day. The main thing you need to know is that the 2 versions of Marauder Champions in the Norsca faction are the only 2 heavily armored melee infantry available to you, or heavily armored is relative here. Although their armor isn't quite as heavy as most other factions, their armor value of 80 can still prove pretty resilient. And you can either take them with a sword and shield, or with a fuck you great weapon. As you might expect, the version with great weapons deal armor piercing damage, while the version with shields do not. But the version with shields have higher melee defense and missile resistance. In case you don't know, which is totally fine, this is true across most units in Total War. Marauder Champions have great stats, as one might expect from elite infantry, but they're definitely not cheap, about the same cost as Black Orcs. Next up are the 2 missile infantry options available to Norsca: the Marauder Hunters with Javelins and the Marauder Hunters with Throwing Axes. As of the time this video is being made, about a week or so after the release of the Norsca DLC, the Hunters with Javelins are easily one of the most powerful missile units in the game. Fuck. Ooh, sorry about that. This is because their base missile damage of 35 becomes 50 when firing at any large unit, so they have a 15 bonus versus large. So that goes from everything from Cav to Shaggoths to Gorbulls to War Hydras to Rat Ogres to Doom Whales. But when you multiply this by 68 or 90, depending on what size you're playing on, you get a very high volume of shots that do very high amounts of damage. Their downside is that they have a relatively short range of 90, and their javelins don't technically pierce armor. If you expect to be fighting large monsters, Marauder Hunters with Javelins are the missile units you definitely want to take. And even if you're not fighting large monsters, give them a whirl. Their more expensive counterparts are Marauder Hunters with Throwing Axes. They sacrifice both missile damage and range to gain armor piercing damage, which, can never be underestimated. A volley of axes from this unit can really put the hurt on pretty much anything, but your most ideal target are units that rely on heavy armor to stay in the fight. The challenge with them, and it is quite a challenge, is getting them into position. With a range of only 65, you have a very slim window where you're close enough to even fire, but still far enough to keep them from being, tied up. The good news is, like their melee counterparts, both hunter units have the rage mechanic. So if they do get stuck in combat, they aren't pushovers. They can definitely do okay for themselves. Alright guys, so next we're actually going to cover the Norscan monsters and beasts. We're going to go a little bit out of order here. I will, of course, get to the cav and chariots, but frankly, I'm just sick of looking at shirtless dudes. I need a break. So let's start off with the Ice Wolves. Ice Wolves are one of the first Norscan units that truly embody the cold hard north. Their icy blue color is a dead giveaway of the frostbite mechanic, which they have built into their melee attack. So again, frostbite lowers the enemy unit's speed by 52% for 10 seconds after every successful hit. This is a very valuable tool for Norsca, who generally wants the enemy to stay put long enough for their heavy hitters and monsters to pound them into the ground. But in the case of the Ice Wolves, they can do some of that heavy hitting themselves because they have a weapon strength of 42, much higher than traditional Warhound units in other factions. So, obviously these are not the same. These are not traditional Warhound units, so they're not meant to be used in the same way. Even further evidenced by their much smaller unit size. You should use these guys in conjunction with something that's slow, and use them to slow down a unit that you fear will cycle charge or run away or is just faster than you, or chasing down missile cav and slowing them long enough for something else to catch up with. Fucking hate missile cav. But, if you do want a more standard Warhound unit, Norsca also has those. These little chaos puggies are fast, low-tier units meant to slip around the flanks, kind of tie up enemy skirmishers, or just chase down your opponent's routing units. Handgunners and other missiles are one of the hard counters to the Norsca faction, so use these doggos to counter your hard counter. Wow, such counter. Dude, I know how you guys love memes. The Beasts of Tashnar are the Regiment of Renown Warhound unit, and they can do a little bit more than eat Wood Elf archers, although, by all means do that. They have Frenzy, which gives them some heavier hitting potential, as well as a small anti-large bonus. In conjunction with some Skin Wolves and Frostbite, they can help play a pretty vital role in dealing with enemy cav. This unit can also Vanguard deploy, so you can move them up into position earlier in the battle. Alright, so moving on to maybe my favorite unit in the entire Norsca faction, besides that, well, I guess it's kind of the same as the one I already said was my favorite unit, but Skin Wolves. Skin Wolves are one of the most important and unique units in the Norsca faction. They're basically werewolves, but Games Workshop tries to stay away from generic terms because they can't copyright those. So we have Skin Wolves. Skin Wolves are a very fast and very dangerous unit that essentially fill a pretty huge gap in the Norsca roster. They're a mobile unit that can deal with cav. One of the most defining features of the Norsca faction, like I already said, is they don't have access to traditional shock or melee cav. But I'm saying it a lot because it's important, it's one of their main weaknesses, so you need something that can mitigate it. But when you do as much damage to large units and cav units as Skin Wolves do, which is a base of 60 plus a bonus versus large of 30, you might come to realize that you never needed cav at all. And while the regular variety does lack armor, what the fuck? Holy shit. Fucking, biggest bug of my life just crawled on me. Coda is a little girl. Alright, fuck. Let's see. And, while the regular version does lack armor, they're a lot more durable than they let on, because like any good werewolf, they have a physical resistance, and more importantly, they regenerate, so they can recover lost health throughout the battle. This makes them a very reliable unit that can provide even more value again in the endgame. But if you're finding your furries getting poked down by missiles, even, with regeneration and a physical resist, you can always slap some armor on them for just a few pennies more. The armored Skin Wolves combine all of the offensive output of regular Skin Wolves, but are over 3 times as durable, with an armor value that actually makes a difference. However, they do sacrifice some speed for their heavier weight. Armored Skinwolves are a very potent unit, and I personally find them very effective because they can play both offense and defense. Skinwolves aren't without their weaknesses though. They take extra damage from fire because of regeneration, so fire arrows, Knights of the Blazing Sun, and the Flaming Sword of Ruin can really put their hurt on them fast. And while they're quick, they aren't as quick as most Cavs, so they can still get cycle charged if they don't have frostbite support. They also don't do armor piercing damage. That is, of course, except for their Regiment of Renown unit, the Maws of Savagery. In my opinion, one of the two best Regiment of Renown units on the roster, maybe the best, and actually three are really good. I totally regret not putting these guys in my list of top 10 new Regiments of Renown. Not that it really matters, but these guys can go toe-to-toe with most Cav units in the game because they can pierce armor. They're the only Skinwolf besides the Werekin that can do so. And as of right now, they are a steal for the gold that you pay. Even if that goes up, the Maws of Savagery will likely still be an auto-include, especially if you want to spring a Vanguard trap, which they can do as well. Skinwolves aren't the only monsters lumbering alongside the Marauder tribes of Norsca, far from it actually. The services of trolls are available as well, if you can stand the smell. And for Norsca, they come in two varieties, regular and extra icy. The regular trolls are carbon copies of regular trolls in the Greenskin and Chaos factions. Low leadership, low armor, but good armor piercing damage and auto health regen. It's the ice trolls that really stand out from the crowd, especially because of their freezing blue aura that's easily picked out from like across the battlefield, well before you can even see their unit icon. Ice trolls are one of the coolest and most thematic units on the Norsca roster, and they provide some pretty good utility as well. They do frostbite damage on their melee attacks, which should be pretty clear just by looking at them. They're kind of like poisonous, I wonder if we'll see that with like the lizardmen. You know how poisonous frogs and stuff, brightly colored ones, indicate they're poison? Well, in the case of Norsca, if it's blue, it's got frostbite. They also do even higher amounts of armor piercing damage than their dirtier kin. Few things look more badass than drunk Uncle Throg marching into battle with a unit of ice trolls, so I recommend it. But things get even weirder from here. Famir warriors are a mysterious, goofy-looking race of reptilian humanoids that live in the bogs and swamps of the Chaos Wasteland. But call them goofy to their face and not online, and see what happens. In my opinion, they're kind of a dark horse unit. They seem to be kind of underestimated by Norsca players and opponents alike, at least in my limited experience, could be wrong. Their first strength is their offense, their damage output. They do armor piercing, armor sundering, and magic damage. Never before has armor sundering been so easily accessible to a faction, although it looks like the Skaven are going to give them a run for their money. Armor sundering is the mechanic that lowers an enemy unit's armor by 30 for 10 seconds after each successful hit. And it's a force multiplier because it can really make your lower tier units perform a lot better. A group of Famir warriors mixed in combat with some berserkers, for example, is a brutal synergy. But in my opinion, their real value is in their durability. Their armor stat of 110 isn't just good, it's really good, it's great. For reference, that's the armor value that Black Orcs have. We're talking like dwarf tier here. It's especially good in the Norsca Faction, who tends to be more of a lightly armored army overall. This armor value makes them among the most durable monstrous infantry units in the entire game. And while the regular Famir warriors do great damage, the variation with great weapons turn it up a notch. Their damage per hit not only goes up, but it gains an anti-large bonus as well, making them a very lethal unit to heavily armored cav or even, large monsters. But their downside is that they're slow and a little bit clumsy, so it can take a while for them to get up the field. That is, of course, unless you take the Miststalkers, the regiment of renowned Famir warriors with Vanguard deploy. The Miststalkers use the extra thick fog that surrounds them to lay an ambush, giving them the stalk ability as well. Vanguard and Stalk are great, but the most valuable ability the Miststalkers bring to the table is Terror. They're an armor-piercing, armor-sundering, magic damage-dealing Vanguard unit with Stalk, Terror, and an armor stat of 110. I should mention too that all Famir warriors have a special mechanic that provides them with a 20 or 22% missile resistance while their leadership is above 50%. So, that can come in handy. Famir warriors in general are best used as a support unit with a mob of infantry because that's where their armor sundering will give you the most value. Their downside is their lower speed, small unit size, and relatively low leadership. But in a faction that's vulnerable to cav, these guys will make your opponents think twice about charging into your back lines. Moving on to the Feral Manticore, the Manticore is one of the more skipped over monsters in the Norsca faction, mostly because it's a copy-paste from the Warriors of Chaos roster. It's one of only 2 flying units in the roster, and it causes terror. Its added mobility can be useful for Norsca because it has the speed to support units on the flanks, like Skinwolves when dealing with cav and generally fast units. It can also gum up the works by getting into enemy skirmishers or artillery crews, preventing them from firing at your more valuable targets. Overall, so far, I haven't seen the Feral Manticore getting a ton of use from Norsca, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. Moving on to the Norscan Cav and Chariots, or should I say Missile Cav and Chariots. I probably sound like a broken record by now, but Norsca doesn't have any traditional melee or shot cav. I think I say it a lot because, in my opinion, it's pretty significant. But what they do have, however, is the Marauder Chariot. The Marauder Chariot is a pretty decent chariot for its cost. It's very similar to the cheaper variation of Chariot in the Warriors of Chaos faction. It has an armor value of 85, which makes it one of the better armored units on the roster. And it also has a bonus versus infantry of 18, which is pretty huge. Like most chariots in Total War, it can be a total menace if you keep it moving. Keep it charging, keep it targeting enemy infantry units, and just generally give it the micro that it needs. Bear in mind though that it does not do armor piercing damage, so try to keep it away from elite infantry. Trust me, you have plenty of other units for that. It also has the rage mechanic, but in this case it's sort of a bailout because you don't want to leave it in combat long enough for that to kick in. The next chariot on the Norsca roster is only a little bit more expensive, but about twice as cool. And we all know that in Warhammer we go by the rule of cool. The Ice Wolf chariot is both a missile chariot and a melee chariot. This makes it pretty versatile, but somewhat more difficult to use for players who don't really want to give it the extra micro. Difficult relatively speaking. It has a few things for you to remember. Its missiles do armor piercing damage, however its melee attacks do not. And its melee damage gets a bonus versus infantry and does frostbite, but its missiles do not. So, not rocket science, not a ton to remember, but twice as much as most other units, I guess. All in all though, this makes it kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It has the tools to deal with different threats. So low tier, lightly armored infantry, like say Skaven clan rats, you want to just bust through into melee combat. But heavily armored elite infantry like say High Elf Phoenix Guard, you want to throw axes at from far away. And as far as missile cav go, Norsca once again borrow from their chaotic cousins. The 3 options they have, Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes, and Marauder Horse Masters, are literal carbon copies from the Warriors of Chaos, only once again they have the rage mechanic. And although it's probably not what you want to use them for initially, having units like this charge in as kind of a plan B does certainly happen, so rage could help these guys out. While the basic Marauder Horsemen are just cheap, lightly armored missile cav, they are definitely pretty quick and can also Vanguard deploy, as can the Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes. The main difference being that the throwing axes do armor piercing damage, never something that can go ignored for too long. What's kind of cool is that the Marauder Hunter missile unit, the infantry unit I covered earlier, is a variation of this unit, only obviously not on their horses. But the highest tier of the 3 are the Marauder Horse Masters, who dish out a higher amount of missile damage than either of their counterparts. However, they do lose the armor piercing damage, and unlike the Marauder Hunters, these guys' javelins don't get a bonus versus large. Still, all 3 of these units can be helpful in terms of giving some mobility to the Norsca faction. Alright guys, so here we are, the main event, the grand finale. Rare monsters and beasts. You know a faction has great monsters when they can't keep them all in one unit category. And let me just tell you, Norsca has a lot of them. The first one, the Norscan Giant, may be a familiar unit, but not a familiar face. At least I hope not, for your sake. He's simply another giant, making Norsca the 4th faction to employ the big guys into service. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because the giant's weapon strength of 530 is still king, even if it's now closely rivaled by some of the quadrupeds on the roster. Although giants are quite a bit slower than the other heavy hitters out there, they have a superior melee attack stat, and more importantly, superior leadership. They are far less likely to rout, which can never be underestimated, especially because so many other monsters have very low leadership. But the single best part about this guy, hands down, is his new model. Just don't do warp dust, kids. The Frostworm is a twisted, double-headed chaos dragon that's been imbued by the sheer cold and magic of its harsh environment. He's an ice dragon, a lot like what's gonna happen to one of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons in Game of Thrones Season 7 Episode 9. He causes terror, does armor-piercing magic damage, and can fly. But what sets him apart from the forest dragon of Athel Loren is his ability to debuff speed, even more severely than the other units on the roster. In addition to Frostbite, which lowers speed by 52%, he has the Chilling Aura ability, which lowers the speed of all enemies around him by 36%. And yes, in times where this is possible, these abilities do stack, resulting in slowing down a unit so severely that it may as well be netted. I've seen a lot of mixed feelings about the Frostworm, like from the community, everything from its model to its general battlefield purpose, and I think the biggest point of contention is, overall, some think that dragons in general just aren't powerful enough in Total War. But that's something that you'll have to decide for yourself. Personally, I'm waiting until the Star Dragons come out. But in the meantime, I think that the Frostworm's biggest purpose on the Norsca roster is to use his mobility to cripple your enemy's mobility. Remember, not many units can fly in this faction, so, use him to catch something. But just make sure you send support as quickly as possible because he's not a one-man show. Quite unlike the last species of monster on the Norsca roster, the real main event. The anchors of the Norsca faction are the gigantic Chaos-Corrupted Mammoths. These monsters are literally living battering rams built to completely annihilate lines of enemy infantry. It says right on their unit card, anti-infantry, and if you scroll over their already huge armor-piercing weapon damage of 525, you'll see their game-changing anti-infantry bonus of 5. So the Feral Mammoth is a perfect example of how you don't need a bonus to be anti-infantry or anti-large or something like that. The reason the Mammoth is anti-infantry is because of the massive surface area it covers when it attacks by swinging its tusks. It's splash damage on steroids. They also have such a high mass value that the impact damage from their charge can cripple most units in the game, infantry or not. The Mammoth units are one of the key ways Norsca dominates the frontline engagement. But really, instead of anti-infantry, the card could just say anti-everything because the Mammoth pretty much indiscriminately shits on whatever it's fighting. One of the many key things to note about this unit, whether you're using it or fighting it, is how it dishes out the damage. It has a very low melee attack stat, but for the most part, it doesn't need it, because it's using impact and splash damage to do most of the job. Now, I don't have the formula for exactly how these things work, there are hundreds of formulas in this game, but it's pretty clear after the first, 1 or 2 times you get run over by one that it can do huge amounts of damage even with very low melee. But they aren't without their weaknesses, namely a very high volume of missiles, especially the Feral Mammoth, as its armor value of 30 is very low, making everything from crossbows to starfire shafts to handguns all hurt. The Feral Mammoths also have amongst the lowest leadership of any monstrous units in the game, so they are susceptible to routing. But their HP pool of 8,000 means that it takes a lot to take them out of the fight, and if they rout early, they'll just be back for round 2. And if the Feral Mammoth seems tanky with an HP pool that high, the War Mammoth trumps him with an additional 2,000 HP, for a grand total of over 10,000. That's when playing on large unit size. But what's even better, or worse depending on which side the Mammoth is on, is that its armor stat goes from 30 to 70. So this isn't the highest armor value in the game, but it's not the worst either, and it makes the War Mammoth significantly more resilient against non-armor piercing missiles. On top of the War Mammoth is a Hoda where Marauder Hunters chuck their anti-large javelins. This just adds insult to injury. While the War Mammoth tears through the enemy lines of infantry, the javelins on top punish any cav that would try to come save the day. Granted, their range is short, and leaving the javelins on fire at will does make the Mammoth get tired twice as fast. One of the other benefits of the War Mammoth over its feral cousin is a slight increase to leadership and melee stats, although both are still fairly low. The War Shrine Mammoth replaces the javelin-throwing Marauders for a dark, arcane engine manned by a Shaman Sorcerer. Easily one of the coolest models and graphics in the game, in my opinion. Gets me pretty hyped for Dark Elves. The War Shrine loses its missile presence, but gains two things that are much more valuable. The first is, it provides a constant +10 leadership buff for all friendly units within 40 meters. This is gigantic for a faction like Norsca. I cannot stress how good that I think this is. Low leadership is one of the key weaknesses of the Norsca faction. An additional 10 is huge. It can easily make the difference between winning or losing several engagements. Secondly, it gets to imbue one unit with Unbreakable for 16 seconds. So you pop this on a critical engagement where your unit is about to rout, and yeah, that can be game changing. The last variation of War Mammoth, last regiment of renown, and final unit on the Norsca roster is the aptly named Soul Crusher. The Soul Crusher is sort of an albino War Mammoth that's especially prone to anger problems. In addition to its improved melee stats, Soul Crusher can activate a 44% ward save, or damage resist, for 11 seconds. This applies to anything: physical, magical, fire, artillery, range, combat, you name it. But luckily, it only lasts for 11 seconds, and it starts on a cooldown, so it's not going to save Soul Crusher from the hail of fire on the way up to the battle. But it can certainly come in handy if you see your opponent lining up a combo to take it down. Say, for example, right after his handgunners get back into position and are just about ready to fire, or right before something like the Royal Altdorf Griffites make contact. There you have it, guys, a complete in-depth review and analysis of every unit on the current Norsca roster. Norsca are a true powerhouse, there's no two ways about it. But you need to keep them together, keep their leadership up, and don't let the enemy spread you out and pick you apart with missiles. Probably the single greatest thing about Norsca in Total War Warhammer has nothing to do with stats or strategy. It's the fact that Creative Assembly made a minor faction come to life. Norsca was always part of the Warhammer lore, but it never had any supported models or army rules or anything like that from Games Workshop, so this is the most alive they've ever been, and it shows a ton of promise of what could come next for the Total War trilogy. As always, guys, thank you for listening. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you for your support. This is Coda. Thanks for watching, and take care.